I was just going back to the story you're talking about. People's actions don't necessarily correlate to their thoughts. You know, I recently wrote a short story and showed it to my class about a murder story, and they're all rather scared of it. But I wasn't thinking any of those things, and it was purely a creative exercise. Do you think the same thing may have occurred there?
Absolutely, and I think again, but what I would say is, excuse me for dictating to you what you're thinking, but but I think you probably were thinking them as you were writing them, but there was no intent or action. This was your free expression, your free thoughts that you then put onto paper, but for the purpose of creating something. And again, there have been cases, I think there was a case last year or a couple of years ago in the States where I think a high school kid or even a college student, no, not Virginia Tech, there was actually there was a case after Virginia Tech where I think a teacher handed her pupil over to the police because he'd written a violent fantasy and she thought he was going to go and shoot everyone. So,
can I just make, sorry to cut you off, sorry, I think coming back to the blurry lines point that you were making earlier, that I think there's a scale to which we can talk about here, that if you wrote something that wasn't personalised and didn't state in there that you had a desire to do it, that's different to someone else who wrote something where he stated he had a desire to do it. And then the third level is somebody who has a desire to do it and personalises it against a specific individual. And I think that though I am loath to sort of try and ban things or silence people's voices, I can empathise with somebody who feels threatened that if somebody's written against them in person and expresses that they would desire and want to torture that person to death, I can empathise with that victim of, the subject of that story feeling scared if that person came near them. And we have to consider that as well, because I, for example, the reason why it's close to my heart is I'm the subject of many death threats because of my work. And people write about how they dream of chopping my head off. Now, if people if I met one of those people and he's standing next to me, in Pakistan I was attacked and punched in the face, but that person who attacked me didn't express that he wanted to kill me, but there are others. Now, if one of those people was standing next to me, I would feel that that's an invasion of my space. So we also have to consider it from that perspective, that if somebody personalises their expression and says, yes, I want to actually target this individual, then I think there is a role sort of there to discuss as to whether that's appropriate.
Yeah, that seems something. Obviously, what's happening to you is horrifying and incredibly distressing for you.
And probably for Cheryl Cole as well.
Well, sure, but there is the thing. It's the whole thing that takes one into another area of celebrity and fame and privacy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the extent to which a celebrity becomes a public figure, and then you become a public figure. So a writer might want to write something about you. And I think in Crash, in Ballard's Crash, there's the whole thing about Elizabeth Taylor, the whole fantasy of Elizabeth Taylor, for example, wasn't there? And again, so it's this very difficult area where, in your case, you're experiencing these direct threats and harassment that are certainly something that the police should act on, without a doubt. But in the case, there are times when it's difficult to make the distinctions.
Yeah, of course.
And there are times, but at the same time, there were a whole series, if we're talking about obscenity, there were a whole series of cases in the 70s, all of which John Mortimer took on. Nobody wanted to touch these cases. He was the only QC in town who wanted to do them, and was prepared to do them.
The Oz trial.
Mm?
The Oz trial.
The Oz trial, but then also the Linda Lovelace trial, I think Last Exit to Brooklyn as well. Then there was a Little Red School Book. There was a whole load of them in the 70s, and there were certain precedents that were laid down. One of which I think was around the Last Exit to Brooklyn. That in a sense it said in court that a writer did have the right to go and write something completely revolting and violent. It was put much more eloquently than that. And it wasn't necessarily going to cause any harm to society.
No, it's just like my only point was personalising.
Yeah, no, I understand completely, and
Otherwise, of course, I've got my own copy of Marquis de Sade.
I think possibly part of the analysis of this, because there's a postmodern, a post-construction analysis of this, but if you look at Berlin, Isaiah Berlin, the freedom from and the freedom to, the cornerstone of modern liberalism, your freedom to write something which is artistically challenging and has elements of obscenity or violence or whatever is not seriously challenged in a modern liberal democratic society, but the freedom from individualised harassment and insults and so forth. If, for example, some hypothetical head of some hypothetical Nazi fascist party in Britain started making aside comments about it wouldn't be a bad idea if black people were hung on street corners, it wouldn't take the population very long to realise the hints and innuendo that were involved there. So, you know, there's clearly a legitimate tension that has to be resolved between these competing rights. That doesn't mean to say that the right to express things in a very graphic and difficult way should be diminished. But I think it does also mean that individuals have rights in their own right that have to be respected.
There's a question.
Sorry.
I just want to ask you very quickly at the end. Would you be more scared of the people who write you death threats? If you have two groups of people and half of them write you death threats and half of them just think the things, which ones are you more scared of?
Sorry to sort of break it down, but if somebody publicised the fact that they've written a death threat, I'd really be scared of them because they wouldn't necessarily be publicising if they meant it.
Yeah.
What's more concerning is the anonymous threats. And then if I became aware that the person next to me was the author of an anonymous threat, then I think, right, obviously he's near me because he doesn't think I know.
Yeah.
So that's actually where there is, of course, real concern. So it depends on the nature of the threat and the nature of the person.
Because stopping someone writing something doesn't stop them thinking.
Of course not.
Can I ask you a stupid question? Why do these people want to kill you?
They look at my work and they think that what I am doing is okay. Let's take it back to why Napoleon wanted to kill Boxer on a farm, and chopping up and making into horse meat. I think basically they consider me as someone who's undermining the very foundations of their ideology and therefore their strength and the potential of them gaining their utopian life in the future. And as a result, I'm an enemy of this future state that isn't yet created, and therefore an enemy of the people, and therefore an enemy of the group that represents the people, and therefore an enemy of the leader that leads that group. And that's literally how it is. And so the leader of this global group I used to belong to has issued an instruction to all of the members around the world that they are not allowed to engage with me in discussion at all. That's absolutely prohibited, and not even allowed to shake my hand. It literally is from animal.
Do they see you as an enemy or as a heretic?
Both. Because I would be a heretic.
Heresy, of course, is heresy is specifically a thought crime, isn't it?
I mean, I'd be a heretic if I thought what I thought, but didn't go around campaigning for it on behalf of the ideas I believe in and against their ideas. But because I'm actually actively involved in this, I think that's one of the reasons why we've been sort of mistakes that were made in the past, that these ideas weren't challenged in public. So I'm actively trying to challenge these ideas, and therefore they consider me as an enemy as well.